As we Zelda fans know, the Zelda timeline isn't as black and white as other chronologies in gaming. The history of Link, Ganon, Zelda, and Hyrule started with a single unified timeline that starts with Skyward Sword, but once we get to Ocarina of Time, the timeline splits into 3 different paths. The Downfall timeline, in which Link loses the final battle against Ganon, the Child timeline, in which Link is victorious and follows the history of Hyrule when he returns to his original time, and the Adult timeline, in which Link is victorious against Ganon and follows the timeline after his victory without him, as he returns to the past. Now that we got that out of the way, Destiny is at hand, and now we finally have the curtain lifted on the next Zelda game, the game that seeks to break more new ground than any other game before it, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, many people have been asking and theorizing and wondering, where does this game take place in the Zelda timeline? Well, it's not as simple as you would think. Trying to place our newest adventure in the Zelda timeline may be the most difficult undertaking yet. Many others have claimed to have ironclad placements in their tow, but taking into account all of the information that we have in our grasp, there are way too many clashing elements and information that twist all the timelines with specific pieces of info that each awards us with more confusion than clarity. This video is going to be very different from the other theory videos that I've done before, and definitely different from other theory placement videos that you probably have seen before. We are going to tackle the issues that this game faces in being placed in the timeline in terms of clashing info and how it works against specific timeline placements. Then I'll finally get into the placement that I believe this game may fit in. Strap down and get ready, let's get into it. First off, let's talk about various important clues that seem to allude to a possible timeline placement. I want to talk about one of the most obvious first, and that is the Master Sword. What happened? The Master Sword has definitely seen better days. We see here that it's been rusted and chipped to hell and back. But one thing that definitely sticks out is that the Master Sword seems to be in the same pedestal deep in the Lost Woods as we see in A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. Not in the Temple of Time, as the temple seems to be in a vastly different location to where the Master Sword appears to be. To be sure, we can look at the comparisons here between Breath of the Wild and A Link Between Past art. We can see the heavily obvious similarities in the location. Coupled with the fact that the sword is in an extreme state of disrepair, suggests that this game takes place sometime in the Downfall timeline, many years after A Link Between Worlds. Well, there's something else that clashes with that. Going back to what I said about the Master Sword not being in the Temple of Time, there is something within that temple that doesn't add up, and that is the statue of Goddess Hylia. Doesn't seem to be a big deal, huh? Well, it kinda is. You see, since the end of Skyward Sword and the humans returning to the surface to establish Hyrule, and the Era of Chaos soon followed, sometime during that, or right after the Era of Chaos, the knowledge of the great Goddess Hylia seemingly vanished from Hyrule to the point she was a mere legend. Get it? Legend of Zelda. Okay, I'll stop. And the only thing that links her, get it? Link, okay, I'm really gonna stop this time, to here in this time after Skyward Sword is the Lake Hylia, and the term Hylians, of course. And even the knowledge of her existence somehow managed to survive after the point of Ocarina of Time. The bloodline of Hylia and an extinction, Zelda, would have been thinned out so much by the time of A Link to the Past in the Downfall timeline, her presence would have receded anyways. Also, the fact that many locations in this game contain her name, like more so than any other Zelda game, even Skyward Sword. So with this in mind, would this game take place closer to that of Skyward Sword? If that was the case, then the Master Sword would still be in the Temple of Time like it would be in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Yet, the temple is in ruin and the Master Sword is elsewhere. Another important factor that we could potentially point to a supposed timeline placement is the reveal of Koroks in Breath of the Wild. For those who need a refresher course, the Koroks are the evolution or the de-evolution of Kokiri that so far have only made an appearance in the Wind Waker. Their existence in the game could suggest that Breath of the Wild may take place in the adult timeline. Playing off of that, there are theories that suggest that Breath of the Wild takes place after Spirit Tracks, back in the original Hyrule in a time where the flood that ravaged Hyrule receded. This would explain why Hyrule is in ruin, the existence of Koroks, and would support the theory of the old man being King Dofnus no Hansen Hyrule. Also, it should be known there is an awful lot of puddles all over Hyrule in this game, which is a bit fishy and could point to the fact that there was water everywhere at a point. Also, the ancient salt, apparently points to the knowledge of the existence of a great sea once upon a time, a while ago. And sure, this would seem like an interesting point in the timeline except for a couple of things, such as the Master Sword. Yeah, last time we left it was in Ganondorf's head, but hey, maybe the sword could have been taken from one place to another. I find that very unlikely. Also, the fact that the Master Sword is in crazy bad shape could mean it was underwater for an extreme amount of time. Then again, not really. Another piece of clashing information is that Hylia's bloodline, aka Zelda, is in New Hyrule in Spirit Tracks, but perhaps they returned to Old Hyrule? So is the adult timeline looking good? Well, there's another piece of information that clashes with that, and that is Wolf Link. But why? He's just an amiibo, isn't he? Well, according to some Nintendo reps at E3, the Wolf Link amiibo will have some sort of significance to the story in some shape, as he is summoned through the amiibo rune ability on the Sheikah Slate. As a refresher, the Wolf Link amiibo can be used to summon Wolf Link in your game to be your traveling companion. So while he does look like he may be an optional gameplay addition in Breath of the Wild, it looks like his inclusion may hold some interesting significance, and the fact that he's summoned through a Twilight portal says something. But is this truly the same Wolf Link from Twilight Princess? I don't think so. I believe the Wolf Link that appears in Breath of the Wild is a creation from the Sheikah Slate based on the memories and information gathered by the Cave of Shadows, an apparition or shadow of the real Wolf Link that has probably since long passed. So this means since you have the ability to summon a Wolf Link with the health based on how well you did in the Cave of Shadows, those trials must have existed sometime in the radical past, thereby placing Breath of the Wild in the child timeline after Twilight Princess as a possibility. But then again, in the entirety of the known child timeline, the Master Sword is resting safely in the Temple of Time, so that is kinda out of the question. So with all of these differentiating pieces of information that clashes heavily with each other, where can we possibly place this game in the timeline? While Hylia's dominating presence in the game calling back from Skyward Sword, the unified timeline, the supposed location of the Master Sword akin to that of A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, the downfall timeline, the existence of Koroks and the water, the adult timeline, and the many things that point to the child timeline including locations and Wolf Link. Where the hell will this game fit? Well, after lots of thinking and research, I have finally cracked the code and have ample reasoning behind it on where this game could take place in the timeline, and much of it is thanks to one overlooked fact in the Zelda timeline. Breath of the Wild takes place in the child timeline in the great future, past Four Swords adventures. There are a number of reasons why the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild would take place in the far future of the child timeline and the Zelda chronology, far ahead of Four Swords Adventures. Not just because of the surface level of thinking. Let's go down the list, shall we? First off is the fact that the child timeline, Hyrule has known the most peace for the most part, and has been able to stay intact and grow when compared to the other timelines. In the downfall timeline, well, it's the downfall timeline, and off the bat, you would think this game takes place in that timeline. Well, no. Thanks to Hyrule Historia, we can confirm that in the downfall timeline, Hyrule has shrunken to a pitiful shadow of its former glory. So Breath of the Wild's massive world could find no place in that timeline. It will be in the child timeline, as Hyrule has grown in considerable size in the future thanks to the proof in Twilight Princess. Also, the adult timeline, yeah, okay, you guys already know the end of that story. Now, playing off the fact that Hyrule has grown and has become the potential to be the biggest in that timeline, the child timeline is also the time in which Hyrule has known the most peace, allowing for many of its notable landmarks and practices to stay intact for the most part. But what the hell does Hyrule knowing the most peace have anything to do with the timeline placement and the story? Well, you kinda just answered that question there already. Knowing the most peace allows for cataclysmic events to be that much more devastating as a whole. Let me explain. The Hyrule we see in Breath of the Wild has gone to ruin. Tragic, right? But whatever occurred here had to have happened in the child timeline because this timeline didn't experience any type of world-shaking cataclysms. If this were to happen in the downfall timeline, oh gee, it's to be expected. I mean, it is the downfall timeline. Yawn. Or if this was in the adult timeline, we already had the Great Flood. Oh boy. See, it doesn't really hit home. But if this were to happen in the child timeline, oh man, the tragedy. Hyrule was in its prime and now it has turned to rubble. Sure, the child timeline had its sporadic issues, but nothing on the level of the downfall or the adult timelines in terms of cataclysms. That is where Breath of the Wild comes into play. Also, this would be an eerie way of Nintendo confirming that in each timeline is due for at least one downfall cataclysm event. Hyrule is not safe. But it doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Oh no. Being far ahead into the future gives time for the Sheikah to create many of the towers and shrines in the world of Hyrule, utilizing both new and ancient technology to create Sheikah slates and guardians. Speaking of guardians, they were probably corrected to protect Hyrule by the Sheikah due to the two threats that Ganondorf caused in Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures, which leads me to the Calamity Ganon. From what we know about the Ganon in the Child Timeline, not many people know about his existence or the role as Ganon, except for his brief appearance in Four Swords Adventures and in Twilight Princess. Let me explain. Ganon was never identified as his prime threatening role in the Child Timeline, due to Link returning from the future in Ocarina of Time and preventing Ganondorf's rise to power, and Ganondorf's first appearance as Ganon according to the Zelda Timeline. In Twilight Princess, many years later, he is only referred to as Ganon briefly by Zant, and encountered briefly by Link and Midna, with those three only hearing the name Ganon in that sense. Fast forward to Four Swords Adventures. Ganon only makes one appearance in the game and appeared before 4 Links and the 7 Maidens. These events are the only logging of Ganon in the Child Timeline, and even with those scarce appearances, who knows if the knowledge lasted or was even made public at all to the drastic future. Leading me to believe that the reason why Ganon is referred to the Calamity Ganon is because people weren't exactly sure on what it was or how to stop it, leading to the drastic decision to seal it within Hyrule Castle after it laid waste to the kingdom. But hey, what about the Master Sword not being in the Temple of Time and the Koroks? Well, let me tackle the Koroks. First, it's actually pretty simple. The Kokiri more than likely evolved into the Koroks in the Child Timeline, just like they did in the Adult Timeline. They were nowhere to be found in Twilight Princess, with Hyrule Historia even commenting on their absence, so this could go along with that notion. And now the Master Sword. Oh, the Master Sword. This is the piece of information that everyone has been overlooking. The supposed location in the trailer would have you believe that it is indeed the Lost Woods, not the Temple of Time, and therefore placing it in the Downfall Timeline, right? Well, actually, it is still in the Temple of Time. As we know, in Twilight Princess, the Temple of Time from Ocarina of Time was left to rot in the Sacred Grove, and the Master Sword remained there, surrounded by forest, similar to that of the Lost Woods in the Downfall Timeline. And on page 96 of Hyrule Historia, when referring to the Master Sword's location in the Lost Woods in the Downfall Timeline for A Link to the Past, it states, the Master Sword was once stored within a temple, but the temple decayed and turned into a forest, making this the completely decayed Temple of Time, since the Master Sword has only been stored in one known location, and that is the Pedestal of Time within the Temple of Time, in its future and past incarnations. Yeah, about that Hyrule Castle that we see in the Wind Waker, I have a theory that it's built on top of the Temple of Time in that timeline, but that's for another video. So, the Master Sword shown here in the trailer is indeed still in the Temple of Time that only decayed more since Twilight Princess. Then, what of the Temple of Time that we've seen in the trailer and in the gameplay for Breath of the Wild? Very simple. That is not the same Temple of Time from the Ocarina of Time era. That is indeed a third version of the Temple of Time. The second Temple of Time was built as a successor to the first Temple of Time that was lost to time in Skyward Sword in the Lanayru Desert. So it is possible that a third Temple of Time was built in order to have one due to the second being lost to the forest in Twilight Princess. This would explain why this temple is bigger and in a higher location, and will also explain why it contains a statue of Hylia in this version. Speaking of Hylia, that's another confusing and clashing piece of the puzzle. Hylia. As I've stated before, that the memory of Hylia had vanished by the time of Ocarina of Time, with the only trace of her existence being linked to Lake Hylia and the Hylians. But now we have a statue of her in the Temple of Time, various landmarks with her name, and the Sheikah monks within the shrines reference her directly by name. But what's even more odd and suspicious is that thanks to the events of Skyward Sword, the goddess Hylia has long since been reincarnated as Zelda, so there will be no reasons to worship, pray, or even remember her as Hylia, as she is now Zelda, so the people will be praying to nothing. But the thing that is most interesting about this whole Hylia debacle is that the Sheikah monks reference her. The Sheikah are the main secret keepers of the entirety of Zelda, and their referencing of Hylia should not be taken lightly, as they will be the first ones to know that Hylia has long been reincarnated. So why would they, of all clans, say this? Well, maybe it's because something has happened in the chronology of Zelda that Hylia has returned to being a goddess. but that's a theory for another time. Either way, the return of Hylia's supposed existence is the only known blank spot in this equation. However, the one thing that we can get from this reinforcement is that the Temple of Time seen in Breath of the Wild is probably not the same temple from Ocarina of Time, but rather a third incarnation of the temple. So what we've got from this: Breath of the Wild is looking to be in the child timeline long after Four Swords adventures in the distant future, due to a number of reasons. Hyrule is the most intact, which allowed it to grow and expand to the Great Hyrule that in turn became wasted. The child timeline has not known a cataclysm. The lack of knowledge of Ganon is in this timeline. The Master Sword remaining in the Temple of Time that decayed completely in the Sacred Grove after Twilight Princess, and that the Lost Woods is indeed the Temple of Time anyways, thanks to A Link to the Past. That Koroks could have evolved from the Kokiri regardless of timeline, the existence of Wolf Link, and of course, we only know so much about the game and there are many more mysteries that are left to be solved that could point this game in a different direction. How did Ganon return with this much strength? Why is the Master Sword rusted and broken? Why was Link asleep for 100 years? So, to have an ironclad timeline placement is still far from happening, but given what we know about Breath of the Wild so far, I'm fairly certain that this is on the right track. So there you have it, HMK's Breath of the Wild timeline placement theory. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it was insightful. So if you have anything to add to the theory or have any comments or questions at all, leave it in the comment section below. And while you're at it, like, favorite, and most importantly, share the video with your friends and subscribe to HMK for more Breath of the Wild content. Until the next one, I've been HMK and I'll check you guys later.